Okay, so let's make a start. See if other people are joining. It's the last session before the break. So thank you all for being here. And today we're going to talk about Anna has to leave. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah. Today we're going to talk about Heidegger and Buber, and trying to explore the relation between the two in terms of their ideas on language and the spoken word, speech. That sort of complex of themes, which in a way runs right through Buber's productivity, or at least from the time of I and Thou. It's maybe good to bring back to mind that I and Thou was published like about 3 or 4 years before Being and Time. So it was already available when Heidegger was writing Being and Time, and then throughout those years, I think there was maybe not a very intense relation between the two. I'm not quite sure, but I haven't researched it, that they met before the war. But then after the war, there is, and you have read that probably in the article that Paul Mendes Floor has written about this. There was this in the 50s, throughout the 50s, there was this sort of engagement, failed engagement, an attempt to meet, but also an attempt to differentiate differentiate themselves from the other. So problematic relationship that, of course, touched on not just philosophical ideas, but also, and especially, I think the historical involvement that both had in the whole period of National Socialism and the war and everything that happened there. And so this was a very fraught relationship, and also a difficult one, but also one in which there is a kind of attraction, or there is some kind of, certainly from the side of Heidegger, but maybe also from the side of Buber, there is the feeling that the two positions at least have something, if not the people, have something to say to each other. And so we thought we put this on the list of topics for this first semester, maybe also as a way into the next semester, where we're going to explore these connections to different themes and different authors in more detail. Some of you have sent some additional suggestions for topics, so hopefully at the end of the session we will have some time to go over the list and try to whittle it down to 6 themes or 6 topic areas. And then to consider whether people might feel interested or called to do some preparatory work on those themes in preparation of one of the seminar sessions for next term. We also mentioned last time that there would be an opportunity to consider a special issue of a journal or a book on Buber in the contemporary world. And I think right now we are sort of having one possibility that we're looking at is to do a special issue of the journal European Judaism, which might be a possibility. And so keep that in the back of your mind, that those who are interested in working either individually or collectively on a text for publication, that we are going to take that forward. Vic, that's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
European Judaism, yeah. Okay. So we'll get to the list of themes later on. I see some other people have joined. Hi, Federico. Hi, Paul. John, you wrote to me. Welcome to our group, and look forward to the discussion. Yeah. So I thought maybe Vic and I were talking about this in preparation, and we came up with a number of themes that we might explore as we see what this relation between Heidegger and Buber, what it means to us and what we can do with it. And I just wanted to, as a keyword, I just wanted to mention this question of humanism. It's also come up several times in our discussions, what the how Buber relates to contemporary trans or post-humanist ideas. He seems to want to affirm a kind of humanist project or a humanist language when he thinks about the relation between, as Paul points out at the end of his article, when he talks about the relation between people, between the peoples of the world. he does so in a specifically humanist language. And in relation to Heidegger, you could say that he tries to affirm a kind of humanist understanding of existence over against Heidegger's critique of humanism, which, of course, after the war was very, very poignant, and in the letter on humanism came out even more clearly than before. So that is one of the themes that we might keep in the back of our minds as we explore this topic.
We wanted to say, just to come in on this, we wanted to say something about how people have come into intellectual work, and the ways in which, since the 1970s particularly, there's been a kind of framing of, particularly through post-structuralism, structuralism and post-structuralist work, a kind of taken for granted anti-humanism, as if humanism was linked to a given conception of human nature, and the notion that somehow underneath, whatever our religious, spiritual, class, ethnic, gender, sexual differences might be, that underneath we're somehow all the same. And that notion made it very difficult to really take seriously differences and the kind of moral meaning of differences. And the turn towards post-structuralist work seemed to be framed through an anti-humanism that allowed us to take both the fracturing of identities, the complexity of the different identities that we carry seriously, and notions of difference seriously. But there have been certain kind of weaknesses in that post-structuralist tradition, but we thought it really might be helpful just to think, almost as part of the process, think about particularly people who've kind of had more academic kind of formations. What was the time that you were a student, either in the 1960s or 1970s or 1980s or 1990s?
Or later.
Or later. What were the common sense visions that were somehow taken for granted in the philosophy, politics, social theory, sociology that you might have learned? And was a kind of post-humanism, a kind of anti-humanism, anti-essentialism, almost part of the bread and butter through which you were formed? So part of an intellectual formation. So part of the richness of this group, which I think is incredibly rich, is because we're almost a global group coming out of very different intellectual traditions, and shaped through very different intellectual traditions. So it seemed kind of significant just in starting to just reflect, or each person reflect upon what formed them, what formed us, such that we took certain theoretical traditions for granted. We might well, and then in what way is Buber's rediscovery or reimagining of humanism at some level a challenge to an anti-humanism or a post-humanist tradition, which is very much dominant in the culture at the moment? So that can both be an excitement in reading Buber, but also a difficulty in reading Buber, because he's unsettling certain kinds of anti-humanist assumptions that sometimes we've been brought up to take very much for granted. So if people are researching Buber or writing as a PhD or something like that, you can find it difficult to defend or to really know where Buber is coming from. And that seems like a really interesting thing, along with just a reflection upon, if people have read Heidegger at any stage, at what stage in your own life and career did you read him? What kind of impact did he have on you?
Is there anyone that would like to make a comment on that?
Okay, I'll jump in where angels fear to tread.
It is a dialogue.
Yeah, well, humanism is very much part of an architectural tradition that says that, buildings are for people, by people, and so forth. And there's certainly within the modern tradition a universalizing sense that people are people, and that one can look at anthropological data of settlements and so forth and find that material still lodged in the heart of modern man. Just to skip forward, I've in my own writing tried to propose that post-humanism is, in a sense, a triumph of humanism. To care about trees, animals, different cultures, to give rights to rivers. The sense that humans are not central to the world is, in fact, a wonderful noblesse oblige on the part of humans. Because trees and animals and rivers don't say that to us. We say that to them. So for me, post-humanism is humanism still, just at another register, a higher register, if you will.
Thanks.
And I see that in Buber. So.
I think that's a really good thing to keep in our minds as we continue the conversation. Katrina, you've raised your hand.
It's just a spontaneous thought about one's intellectual or academic formation and how it relates to the conversations we've been having. So I suppose anti-essentialism would be a key word where I came from. Also, I don't want to say cultural relativism because that's a bit of a red flag, but something going in that direction, a sort of tentativeness, a preoccupation with cultural difference as something that's opaque and difficult and that we have to be cautious about because we can't ever confidently make statements about experiences and realities outside of our own cultural frame, but that's in fact the opposite of any kind of an insular perspective. And then I suppose in terms of things we take for granted, I find this really helpful. So what's sort of there in our vocabulary and a set of assumptions would be something to do with the affirmation of complexity. So the kind of training I've had, and I see myself almost reflexively doling it out again to my own students, but that the complex, the ambivalent, the indeterminate is somehow more valuable or interesting than anything that can be distilled down. And that's why I found Buber, as you say, Vic, troubling and unsettling, sometimes in his very lucid clarity. So that's something I've found really interesting, but absolutely following on from what Michael said, that the post-humanism as post-anthropocentrism might be worth thinking about. Is there a tension or a distinction between humanism and anthropocentrism? So we could have a humanistic non-anthropocentrism, or would that be worth thinking about the differences there?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
That's great.
Other voices. How they all start with Heidegger or Buber. I can tell you that I was raised by a proper hardline Heideggerian philosophically, and I hated every minute of it. And this was Heidegger 2.0. So there already had been a Heidegger wave, and then it went away in the 70s with critical theory, and then it came back in a big way. And it was right from the start. It opened my eyes as a young student in the late 80s to the intertwinement of late capitalism and postmodernism, conservatism, so that these things hang together. And so I was really happy when I discovered Frederick Jameson's The Logic of the Logic of Late Capitalism, The Logic of Postmodernism. And Heidegger was sort of co-opted into that revival of a kind of a differential thought that was kind of nihilism. Yeah, so Katrina said cultural relativism, and I hated that. And why we were talking about it a lot. Why did I hate it so much? Because as Vic and I were preparing for Vic's from a different generation, and for him there was this kind of, I think if I say that correctly, Vic, that it was kind of liberation from an idea of essential identity or universality that everybody had to stick to, Whereas for me, coming as a student, being taught by these postmodernists, what I got was, I saw a world of nepotism and of backstabbing and of people just looking after their own interests and justifying it by an appeal to difference, and that everything was always different and there was no meaning, there was nothing universal. So basically, you could do whatever you liked, and that really sort of irritated me enormously. And so I experienced it as a world in which they were talking about difference all the time, but if you were different, then they had no time for you. And I was, right from the start, I was looking for ways to think differently, and that brought me into contact with the metaphysical tradition and with what metaphysics was really all about. And for a long time, I dabbled in that, and maybe too much to some extent, maybe to another extent, maybe not. And for me, Buber is part of that, but I'm very much aware of the fact that there is a kind of unwelcomeness about it. Something, I think Paul puts it beautifully at the end of his article. There is a kind of schmaltz about this humanism, and what do we do with it? Can we experience that as something that somehow challenges us? That's something at stake, and what is it? How do we think about it? So for me, it is this question of Buber, Heidegger is, and of course there would be post-structuralists who would say that Heidegger is himself still part of his metaphysical tradition, but Heidegger himself certainly didn't think so, and we'll see that in a minute in a few excerpts. So that's how for me this became a big theme. Yeah, I consider these postmodernists my mortal enemies. Yeah.
It's interesting, the generations, because the richness of this discussion is also how we learn to think across different generations and different kind of intellectual traditions. And I remember when I was trained as a kind of analytical philosophy person, and I was a student in an earlier generation to Johann in the mid-60s. I'd read a lot of Buber as an adolescent, and he was part of my kind of unconscious, difficult to talk publicly about in a kind of analytical philosophy tradition, but seemed to say something which was really important about how to live in an everyday life. And some of the sources that Buber used, particularly the Hasidic sources, were very formative. And then I think it was trained as an analytical philosopher, which in some ways is very skilled, but also very narrow. I read Heidegger in the early 1970s. I read Being and Time. And I was in North Yorkshire at the time. And I was completely kind of bowled over by the way that Heidegger did seem to talk about, and I'll just say one or two things because I think they echo, how we were thrown into an everyday world that we took largely for granted, kind of unreflectively. And the analytical philosophy I had learned tended to do that. It took the everyday for granted and tried to analyze and understand the concepts that we could use to understand it. What Heidegger did was say you're thrown into the everyday, and I was in my early 20s at the time, and Heidegger kind of gave you a sense that you thought you were going to live forever. The kind of everyday consciousness that you'd absorbed was a kind of consciousness that meant that life would go on forever, and you were drawn into a kind of everyday consciousness in relationship to that. And then if you think about an example, if I remember a student at Oxford at the time that I was there committed suicide, and I was shocked by it. But what was even more shocking was there was no discussion around this death. It just happened and was regarded as unfortunate. And Heidegger gave you a sense that an accident or something happening like that, an event, could shatter or disturb your everyday experience and understanding and make you aware of your own mortality. And that in making yourself aware of your own mortality, what changed was your whole sense of life, experience, and relationship. And that you could be brought into a kind of understanding of how your mortality meant you were involved in relationships of care and responsibility with others in a way that you might never have recognized. And I think that's always stayed with me, that kind of sense of mortality and the sense of having a different kind of awareness or consciousness. It's not just that we learn more than what we knew before, or that we accumulate knowledge as if it were a possession, but certain events can happen in our lives that completely transform our awareness or consciousness, challenge it in quite radical ways. And Heidegger gives you a language in which, for all its kind of dangers, gives you a way of thinking about that.
Yeah, it can certainly help you to break through a certain being locked up in a kind of cognitivist, subjectivist, typically modern epistemological viewpoint, and reading Heidegger can have the experience of breaking open into the world. Thank you for that, Vic. Does somebody else want to say something about their encounter with Heidegger before we move into the bit of comparison?
I can say something brief, I suppose. I've had only a limited encounter with Heidegger in terms of my own background and influences. I graduated from high school in '89, got my undergraduate degree in '93, and finished grad school right around 2000. So I'm a year shy of 50 now. The early influences on me were quite traditional, I would say, in many ways. My father's a reasonably well-known Lutheran theologian, and so kind of a not well politically, but also just sort of culturally, temperamentally conservative Christian background. Most of my professors at both the undergraduate and graduate level were Straussians. I don't think of myself as a Straussian, but I owe them quite a bit. In my experience, the great virtue of the Straussians as professors was that they insisted their students read important books and take them very seriously. And so that was sort of exactly what I needed as a student and what I was looking for. And so that was an enriching experience. But I didn't get much encounter with postmodern thought. One course as an undergraduate, sat in on a course that Fred Dahlmeyer taught at Notre Dame as a graduate student, and those are my limited encounters with Heidegger. Fred's course was the previous encounter I'd had with Buber, really, because he used I and thou there. But yeah, I think of myself as a fairly traditional scholar in many ways, more or less untouched by the various waves of post this and that. I don't. So my half tongue-in-cheek line is that I don't believe in postmodernism. Not that I don't think that there's a body of thought that goes by the label, but I don't believe that such a thing as postmodernity actually exists. In fact, my pet theory is we're still living in the 19th century, in most important respects. So I've had this limited exposure, but it's not something that I have dealt with a lot, or that I've had to deal with a lot in my undergraduate teaching. I'm at a strictly undergraduate institution. I'm the only political scientist, so I teach everything, right? And don't have time for a lot of in-depth look at particular movements in courses or things like that.
So here there also a kind of this idea of the post or the trans as part of what it is post and trans of. And I think that's an important thing for us as we think about what reimagining humanism might look like. So for both Buber and Heidegger, of course, language, and I think that's maybe a third theme to just briefly highlight, and that's also true for many other philosophers in the 20th century, maybe all of them. language became a central focal point, that somehow understanding language gives us a new way of understanding philosophical questions or philosophical problems, maybe even of solving them. And in general, that we can understand human existence on the basis of thinking about language. And we've seen in Buber several times where he says things like only the human being can speak. And in one of the texts for today, there's also this remark that only the human being is kind or can be kind in that way that requires language as a mediation. Things that we probably would want to think about. But it's in this orientation on language that, if anything, you could start by when you wanted to see how Buber and Heidegger relate to each other. Huh? And I think so that's maybe a third theme that we should mention. Shall I say something about that for a few minutes, and then we go into the discussion? Is that okay, Vic, or what do you think?
Yeah, great idea.
Yeah. I'll just say, I put a few things on. I don't normally use slides, but I thought this is such a difficult topic. I better put some thoughts that I have around it on a few slides. And if it's okay with you, I'll just talk you through it to get kind of a grounding in this question of, well, what is going on here when we look at the relation between Heidegger and Buber. And as we already said, Paul's article goes into the whole history of it and basically says all these things probably much clearer than I can do it. But I just wanted to, I'll just share my screen with you so I can just go through that, and hopefully that will create a kind of common basis after we've explored a little bit how people come to Heidegger and maybe went out of it, and they can form a basis for our discussion. Let me see if I can find out how to do that. Yeah. Right, so here we go. So I just want to, just as a way of introducing this topic, yeah, we have had the text of Between Man and Man, where there is a section that's an earlier text where there is a comparison or there is a discussion of Heidegger and his view of what the essence of the human being is, and Buber puts it into context of a discussion around the relation between philosophy and anthropology. And then there is the later text, The Word That Is Spoken, that I sent around, which is this lecture that was written in the context of a planned conference, which Buber then in the end did not attend. The whole history of that is in Paul's article. There is Paul's article itself that we also had a chance to look at. And then there was the text of, there was the recording of The Word That Is Spoken in German and the written version of that text. And I don't know if you had a chance to listen to the recording or if some of you did, but I think it's very remarkable to just listen to the diction, the delivery of even if your German is not fluent and not maybe a little bit rusty, you can sense so much from the kind of reticence and the shyness that we talked about with Buber himself when it came to relationships or to communication. It's a very formalistic presentation, delivery of that speech, of that text. I thought that was quite remarkable, and maybe we can reflect a bit on that. So, in a way, the relation between Buber and Heidegger is a difficult one. You know, I mean, if I put it bluntly, we have Buber the Jew and Heidegger the Nazi, and what happens there, and why do they look for each other after the war? What was that about? And before the war, what drove them in their reflections, in which right from the start language starts to play an important role. I think there's an interesting way in which the texts from after the war, in which they sort of deliberately almost misconstrue each other. I don't know to what extent it is deliberate. We can talk about that maybe, but there seems to be a kind of, on the one hand, a necessity to approach each other, and on the other hand, also a necessity to demarcate themselves from the other, but maybe also even to misrepresent the other in a certain way. That might be interesting for us to look for. So I thought there was a lot of straw man fallacy going on in the way what they say about each other. And then I was just horsing around a bit. I came up with this subtitle, Strawman on the Field Path. There's a beautiful text by Heidegger, the field path, about the path through the fields, which becomes a metaphor for how we relate to the clearing of being. Yeah. So Buber writes in this early text, which is quoted in Man and Man, according to Heidegger, even on the highest level of self-being, man does not pass beyond a life of solicitude with others. Solitude, maybe, yeah. And that is, I think, one basic thing to say. For Heidegger, the whole point is about, for Buber, the whole point is about the fact that Heidegger does not give the encounter the central place that it has for Buber right from the start. And speech is for Buber the mediation or actualization of that encounter, also what makes it possible. And Heidegger doesn't go that way. You could say there is an early Heidegger, for those who maybe not everybody knows Heidegger very well. There's an early Heidegger, or Heidegger 1 and a Heidegger 2. There's the Heidegger of being and time, which is the Heidegger of the existential analytic of Dasein, of the well, yeah, it's not a human being, but it is that kind of entity that in the light of which, or through which, or as a witness, who can be a witness for being to appear, for beings to appear in a world. I remember that Buber uses that idea in the Distance and Relation essay right in the beginning. For a world, for there to be a world in which beings can appear, there has to be a place, a there, a da, to which or where they can appear. And that is the human being. At least that is the human being, if the human being lives in an authentic relation to being itself. If we give that up, then we could lose, the human being could one day no longer be Dasein, could no longer be that place where beings as beings appear, where we have a sense of awareness of the fact that there is being and that there are beings. We would then become completely enmeshed in a kind of automatic, organic, or technological relation to our environments. And we would no longer be the place where truth can show itself. And in the early Heidegger, that becomes a very important mode of analysis. And you could say this is a kind of existential, it has existential overtones in some extent. Later on, at the end of the 30s, Heidegger goes through what is sometimes called the kere. He goes through a conversion, which is a very religious metaphor in itself. He has a metanoia. He turns around, and the perspective is no longer on individual subjectivity as Dasein, but is on being itself and how being dispensates to Dasein, to the human being still. Dispensates the kind of language in which beings can appear, in which beings can shine or can light up into, and he uses his poetic language, the clearing of being, the open, for there to be an experience of something even existing. It has to stand in a kind of open, and language becomes that which gives that the possibility of that open. Heidegger then starts to say things like, we do not speak, language speaks through us, because language is that which allows a glass to be a glass, which allows a horse to be a horse, which not in the sense that the horse wouldn't exist if the word wasn't there, but the word opens the being of that thing up in its existence, in its being. It's very hard to say these things in a clear way, but I hope that you can maybe understand that a little bit just by trying to imagine what it means for us to be aware that something exists or is. And language becomes the that which makes this possible. So language becomes the house, the house of being, he calls it. It is that in which beings come into their own, in which they belong. They belong to a language. Without the language, there is no being in a way. And the human being is the one who witnesses, who takes account of or takes notice of beings through the language that speaks through us. So we do not speak language. We do not come up with words. We do not make the words. They make us, or they are like wounds in our life, and we listen to them, hear them, we perceive what is going on. We become the shepherds, as he then calls it poetically, the shepherds of being. So language is the house of being, and we are the shepherds of that. And that's in a way, very Christian, you could say, very Christianized idea that we said the purpose of the human being is to sing the grace of God and to witness the creation, and that idea comes there. So I think that's maybe important to understand that for Heidegger, it starts with a kind of this solitude of the existing human being, and it moves towards an apprehension of being, language as that which makes beings shine up, light up, the truth which becomes visible, the truth of being. And in that shift, there's a very fundamental shift in his thinking, but in that shift, the position that remains is that of solitude. Even in the later thought, where we share the language that we speak, a folk or a people shares a language that it speaks, a community shares a language that it speaks, or that speaks through it. Even there, we sort of do not look at each other when we speak, but we look out together to the world that is. And just as in the earlier, in the being and time, there is a relationality, or there is community, but it is sort of standing next to each other, like soldiers marching rather than people meeting. And so I think for Heidegger, that has always, and he always tries to think about our relation to others and the world through that lens, and tries to understand community and togetherness on that basis. Whereas for Buber, right from the start, it's about the encounter. And I think this is where both look for language as a way to account for that, but at the same time, because these orientations are so different, the problem always remains. Yeah. Now, I hope that is remotely relevant. Let's say a few things about language, about what this word means. That can already help us a lot to understand better what the relation between Buber and Heidegger is. I'll come back to this point here about being in time later on. So this word language, maybe I've said this before. This word language, lange or lingua, or there are many other words like it for language in many languages, is the tongue. Yeah? And Sprache or speech or spraak is speaking. Yeah? So what you do with your voice. And taal or taal, in Dutch we have this beautiful word taal. So my Heideggerian teacher used to say you can only think in German, Dutch, and Danish because the English don't have a word for language. The only word for language they have is the tongue. But in Dutch the word is taal. And that, of course, in English is the word taal. And incidentally, the word for counting is tellen in Dutch. We don't have tiller in English. Yeah. And that. So what does this mean? Taal, tail, tellen, counting, recounting. That means to put things together. To put things together under a common denominator. This is what logos originally for Heidegger in Greek is from legein, is collecting. That is what language in its essence is. Yeah. So Heidegger feels that logos or language as tale or as telling, or he calls it sagen, say, yeah, sage in German. That approaches this essence of language as that which allows beings to emerge in their truth or into the open, whereas language puts you on a track of thinking about language as what you do with your tongue, and Sprache puts it on an organic level as what you do with your voice. You see, so already by looking at these words, we can get a lot of what Heidegger is trying to do, and he's trying to say the notion of reason as it developed in Western philosophy as something that is removed from language, is a kind of objectification or reification of this collecting moment of taal, so of tale. I'm going to use this word tale instead of language. You can say that Heidegger throughout his life, I think, moves more and more from Sprache, which you use the word they use in the beginning, to sagen, and he even says on the way to language, I hate this word Sprache, I don't want to use it anymore, I want to say sagen, saying, as opposed to speaking. And he hears this, what I just said, logos as collection, tale or tellen, which also has to do with the word for temple, the template, which is the sort of circumvention within which certain things can be gathered, and that gives them a being. He uses the word story. I think in Paul's article, it even is quoted there in the transcripts of the preparation meeting for that conference, that he says you can think about language as story or saga or something, saga. I saw that afterwards. So as I said, you have to imagine it's almost sitting in a cinema. You're sitting next to each other, you're together, but you're watching at the same thing. You're looking at the same thing. You're not relating to each other. Yeah? And Buber, on the other hand, moves more and more into the direction of sprechen. So he and this is where this unwelcome flavor of humanism and metaphysics and all that stuff that we wanted to get away from for so long, why this comes back. Because for him, instead of moving away from sprechen, from speaking, he wants to go deeper and deeper into it. And for him, the voice, the word that is spoken, the word that is given and exchanged and received between people, that becomes the locus of understanding what language is about. It's very, very different way of looking at it. Yeah? And its reflections on truth at the end of the word that is spoken are the truth of this spoken word, of sprechen, rather than saying or telling. You know? So for Buber, as I already said, this becomes die Sprache spricht. For Heidegger, it's language that speaks, it's not we that speak. Whereas for Buber, that's a quote from the text, the word that is spoken is found in the oscillating sphere between persons, the sphere that I call the between, and that we can never allow to be contained without a remainder in the two participants. I think that is a very far-reaching remark. We have to think very clearly about this in order to understand language. We cannot think only about what happens in me when I utter a word, or in you when you hear a word, or when we exhibit it. There is this sphere of the between that we looked at in distance and relation, and that is essential to the spoken word. It lives in that between. So it becomes the relation, not as something that exists on the basis of the relata, if I put it like that, but the relata are only in that moment of encounter. And you can see that this between is a dynamic thing. It's not a region or a place that exists, but it's something that is enacted in the exchange of words, right? Now, different as that may be, one going into the direction of collection and one going into the direction of speech, when in their view on how language opens us up to being, yeah, neither understand language on the basis of the symbol or the sign. I think that's important. Heidegger talks about the hint at some point. Buber talks about the dialogue in silence, talks about gesture. We talked about this word gesture already. Language is not understood on the basis of signification or symbolization. And of course, there are many other examples around that time of people who had a very different view, Cassiro, for example. But both maintain a classical, maybe in the light of this, both maintain a classical, I would say, Western philosophical prejudice, which was subsequently criticized heavily in post-structuralism, of the priority of the spoken word. Much to the chagrin of post-structuralist media theorists, who like to affirm the priority of writing, or at least maintain that writing and speaking are abysmally distinct. This idea that that voice, that the speech has priority, that actual language is speech. This, of course, is a classic place for this is Plato's Phaedrus, where the critique of writing happens precisely on the basis of an analysis of speech as the primary mode of language. And I think that remains for both of them. Even for Heidegger, who talks about collecting, it's a saying. So even there, we get the activity of uttering words as being the basic form of language, even if it's not our words or if it's language that speaks through us. So that is something that I think they both have, and that's one of the things that later on become problematic. It's difficult for me to talk about because I would like to agree with people who say that writing and speaking are at least equipriorial, but I don't. And this is my sentiment, my classical philosophical sentiment. I also think that speech has priority. Yeah. So for Heidegger, the word, we can then ask what is a word, and I think they both talk about that question in different ways. And it was also one of the themes that were discussed in the preparation for this conference in the 50s. The word allows beings to shine or to appear. Language is the house of being. Without a word, no thing may be. He quotes that line again and again in the lecture that he prepared for the conference by Stefan George. And Buber also quotes that in a sort of veiled critique. We'll get to that in a minute. Because he says, well, it's not true for the encounter. So man becomes the shepherd of being. We said that through thankfully receiving the gift of language. I wanted to point out here, there is it was an old book by Sam Eisseling, who was a Dutch philosopher, he died a few years ago, but he wrote one of his first books, already written in the 50s, I think. It was an introduction to Heidegger in Dutch. It was called Denken en Danken, Geven en Zijn, Thinking and Thanking, Giving and Being. And I think that sums up really, really well this Heideggerian point of view. It's almost like so thinking and being belong together. And that is metaphysics, when we think of thought as either representation or ideation of what is, so that we can truthfully apprehend it. This is the philosophical question. What is the relation between thinking and being? Things are, we think them, what does that mean? In Heidegger, internally, so between these two external abstract forms, the relation between them becomes a matter of thanking and of giving. Being gives, and the human being receives freely, and by receiving freely can think the world in the sense of thank language for giving being to beings. The process of thinking philosophically then becomes a matter of thanking. So to think, for Heidegger, to think being becomes a matter of thanking the giving. And that is, is that a religious thing or not? I mean, it is a difficult question, yeah? But I think it's very important to see, and this maybe has something to do with this attitude shift that Fick talked about in a more existential sense upon reading Heidegger in the context of a person you know that dies. Heidegger tries to jolt us out of an abstract way of thinking that does not see that there is this dimension of thanking and giving going on. But of course, with thanking and with giving, we are also very closely to a relational point of view, just as we have it in Buber. Because for Buber, this word, and he says this time and time again, is given and received. And only in that way it allows us to be with each other and with the world. I think the upshot of the theme of distance and relation is that it is only through this distance, this, how you might call, you might say, how different is it from clearing, from what Heidegger means by clearing, only from this distance in which something is there and I'm not it, but I can relate to it. Only there only through that ontological circumstance can we become with each other, or can we get to be with each other and with the world. And that is what the word gives to us. So the word is given and received in Buber, but differently between people than in Heidegger, where it is also a matter of giving and receiving, but it is language itself giving the light of day to beings and allowing us through language to witness that. almost there. This is a lot of words. I'm sorry, but I wanted to. Is it okay? Shall I go on for 5 more minutes or so? Is it okay? I just want to check. Yeah. Okay. So both. I didn't say that. I said I'll get back to this later. Both are engaged in a kind of critique of presence. Yeah. Both are engaged in this critique of classical metaphysics as a philosophy of presence, a philosophy that says typical, Plato's position: beings exist, and the idea is that which allows us to get the correct view of them, and when we have the correct view of them, we are present with them, and that is what being. When it's not present, it is not. And you could say the whole Heidegger is just to challenge that idea and to say what is not yet or what is no longer is also. And I think that, although Buber doesn't talk about it in that way, he does move in that same direction. And you can see this very easily just when you think about the spoken word, which only exists in contrast with the written word, as what Locke called the perpetual perishing. So if I stop my speech, like now, then there is no word anymore. I can't stop my word. My spoken word only exists as it comes out of nothingness and goes back into nothingness. It is only there so presence is always moving, moving in and out of well, whatever it is, nothingness. Or for Heidegger, it's the nothing. For Buber, it becomes maybe a bit more hazy how he sees that. But the living word, which is such an important notion for him, is this, and the living connection is something that cannot be caught, cannot be put at a standstill. And I think that's where you see in both, where you see the critique of presence. So that critique of presence, which you could take as an abstract problem, like how do we make sense of pure presence without thinking about absence, or what about movement, or etc., which can be a theoretical, metaphysical, ontological problem. As we saw, for Buber and Heidegger, it becomes something much more meaningful, because it is through this awareness through this critique of presence, that we become aware of this giving and receiving dimension in let's call it in being. Yeah? And that's why it's interesting for me trying to develop this idea of philosophy of communication, because communication is about a free giving and receiving. If it's not free, then it's not communication. If you can't respond freely, or if you have to respond in a certain way, or if you have to say a certain thing, or if it's just a causal process, then there is no communication. So the free giving and receiving is essential, and we need this critique of presence that both Heidegger and Buber perform in their own way, in a way to get to this sudden awareness, this attitude shift, that there is a dimension of giving and receiving in being itself. And that then becomes a point that has to do with philosophical method, as I already said. What do you do? So for Heidegger, you could say to be a philosopher means to thank, and for Buber, you could say to be a philosopher means to relate, or to connect, or to share, or to recognize the other in their otherness, and at the same time be together with them. And here I had to think about, and I just wanted to put this in the context of Cartesianism. I was very happy to see that Paul also mentioned that in his article. Both of them, of course, have a critique of modern philosophy, not just of the whole metaphysical tradition, but of the modern tradition. Buber, in the spoken text, talks about the monological nature of modern philosophy. He calls it de-Socratized. But you could probably say with Heidegger that the de-Socratization begins with Plato. This is monological. I think that's a way that Buber would phrase this critique. And for Heidegger, it's a critique in terms of reducing the access to being to the correct view, the correct gaze, rather than hearing the language that gives beings their being. Now, Descartes is, of course, is a starting point for modern philosophy, and it's important for both of them. Remember that Buber went into this intellectual fast before he wrote I and Thou, and he says for 2 years I didn't read anything else, but yeah, of course he read the Torah probably, but he didn't read anything else than Descartes' Discourse on Method. And I thought that was so fascinating when I found that out. Why? What is he trying to do there? What's he going back to? In the case of Heidegger, when we did a few years ago, we had this seminar dealt with this On the Way to Language. We studied this text for a year. At one point, it occurred to me that unterwegs zur Sprache, being on the way to language, has these words in it. So discourse is language, and method, which meta hodos, means to go on the way. So method is to go away, not to go away in the sense of disappear, but to go on a way. And the discourse is the language. So it's not too difficult to see unterwegs zur Sprache as a kind of commentary on some aspects of the discourse on method. It's an inversion, as it were. And it's also not so difficult to see I and Thou as a comment on Cartesian philosophy, on the discourse on method, but maybe also on the meditations. You could say that certainly what happens in well, yeah, I wrote it down. I'm going to read it out. So if you consider the meditations and the discourse on method, sorry, there's a comment. Or have people already read it? Oh, Anna, you need to leave. Yeah, okay, that's fine. But check out the recording. Yeah, thanks for letting us know. So both the meditations and the discourse on method, these two foundational texts by Descartes, bask in the light of the spoken living word of dialogue, but they cannot acknowledge it. You only have to pick up the book Tollerlege to see that. The explicit philosophy expounded in them has no place for it, because in the voice, if you think about the voice, res extensa, the world of matter, the extended world, and res cogitans, the cogito, the internal, the mental world, which is this fundamental dualism that Descartes posits. Because in the voice, these two spheres that Descartes says can exist completely separately intertwine, because the voice is embodied, is embodied mind in a way. But what is the place where this merging could occur? More than anything else, this place is the between that Buber speaks about. Descartes was a whole lot smarter than people seem to realize. I always want to defend Descartes. That's also one of my hobby horses. People don't understand how totally great Descartes was, and Buber did. Yeah, I think. So Descartes was a whole lot smarter than most people seem to think today. In his letters, he clearly states that the unity of mind and matter cannot be thought out in philosophy. Rather, we have to become acquainted with it and come to understand it in the shared practice of daily life. There are these letters to Elizabeth, where I don't have the quotes now, but you can read that for yourself. Daily life is a veritable, he calls it that way, third substance. It's not just matter and mind, it's also that. Yeah? Thus, Buber's philosophy can be seen as a completion of Descartes as much as a critique of it. He simply points out, Heidegger chooses a different path. He reads the split between mind and matter that happens in these texts by Descartes as the beginning of the great reduction of beings to information, which finds its current paragon in Darwin. So first you get, in Descartes' hands, the piece of wax. I don't know if you notice this part in the meditations where Descartes says, I'm sitting in front of the stove and I have a piece of wax and I can still smell the fields, and I can still see the sunlight in it, and I smell the bees, and it's this live thing that's connected to everything. But now it starts to melt in the heat, and it loses its color, it loses its texture, it loses its scent, and it becomes just this pure extended nothingness. And he says that's res extensa. So all the qualities have disappeared from it. And that's then, you could say, the idea of matter as it exists in maybe what became the scientific mindset. It's a great reduction. Yeah? And that goes on and on, Heidegger says. With Darwin, also our internal world has become reduced to this sort of pure extended information processing. That's the reign of technology. Rather than seeing the third realm as an existentialist leap out of the modern epistemological disposition, which early Heidegger may still have toyed with in Being and Time, in the later Heidegger, it becomes our belonging, or Zugehörigkeit, which has the hearing in it, to language as the dispensation of being that makes it so that all beings, including the one that knows about its own mortality, the human, appear as information. The thinker and poet listen to the words that circle around us and bear witness to the Geschick, the sending as well as the arranging or fuguing of beings that language is. Language is happening, event or recurring, in which things are given over to the human being to shine. Language is grace. For Heidegger, what started with Descartes, this great reduction of all this metaphysical garbage into the world of technology, information, and control, that is language speaking to us. That is what language is telling us. And we are fooling ourselves if we think that we can do anything else than just observe that and be witness to it, knowing that to be witness to it is not to be part of it. The essence of technology is not technological. The essence of language is not linguistic, Heidegger says. So there is a path for thought here carved out, but it is a very different one from the one that Buber, basing himself on the same texts, makes, and what I just said. He says there is a third realm. These are just abstract ways of thinking. They might have their place, but there is even in Descartes already a third realm, and that is the dialogue. And both the meditations and the discoursal method, if you read that text, they are dialogues. Meditation is a dialogue with the self, and it is a dialogue with the reader. And it's almost as if there is a sort of blind spot in Descartes for that level of reality. He constantly talks to his reader. He says, oh, you can read this all in one sitting if you take a bit of time, otherwise split it up in 6. And I was in Germany in war, and I decided to sit down and have a good think, and this is what happened. And he comes back to the reader time and time again. So he is engaged throughout in the dialogue, and it's the same with the discoursal method. And so I think that what Heidegger tries to do is to go deeper than Descartes' philosophy and show how this is the beginning of an approach to the world as total calculation. And then not to put an alternative to that, but to say that is how being appears now, and that is what philosophy can think and thank in a weird way. But you also see the fascist leanings there. Fascism is not about saying no to technology; it's about saying yes to technology. So that's Heidegger's path, which is very, but it starts with the same basis. And so Buber gets from Descartes dialogue, and Heidegger gets from Descartes language as die Sprache that spricht, that speaks. Yeah? So you could say if existentialism, I hope that that's clear, how I see that. So you could say if existentialism is the true heir of Descartes, the cogito becomes the subject, becomes the existentialist individual. Buber sobers us up from this existentialism by pointing to dialogue and the between, and Heidegger sobers us up from this existentialism by pointing to language that speaks us. Both devise a critique of method with respect to modern philosophy that overtakes German idealism in the form of neo-Kantianism, against which both Heidegger and Buber in their early days sort of rail against. I and Thou is an anti-neo-Kantian text, and so is Being and Time. And that leaves the choice between these two to us. Yeah? The fact that the first chapter in Heidegger's On the Way to Language, I'll show you a little clip of it, is called a dialogue on language, in which, without mentioning him, Buber's reflections on the spoken word and the I-thou relation are discarded, while yet the moment at which it becomes possible to say something, a moment prefaced in that text by an unfathomable hesitation. They sit page after page, the participants in the dialogue, they had the dialogue between ein Japaner und ein Fragender, a Japanese and an inquirer in the English translation, deals with, so the inquirer, which is Heidegger, asked the question, so what is then the word for language in Japanese? and this becomes something that's almost impossible to even talk about. There's hesitation upon hesitation upon hesitation, and then finally this word comes out, kotoba, which is very close to Heidegger's view of language. You'll see that maybe in a minute. So you get so you get an enormous awareness of the difficulty that we even experience now as we are talking now together. The difficulty of getting into view what language is. It is not just a matter of how do you get it or do you not get it. It is a path in thought that we have to go. Just as in the Cartesian meditations, you can't just summarize it. You have to go that. That's what Descartes' whole point. You have to go that path yourself. Otherwise, you won't. It won't mean anything. Yeah? So you get that critique of Buber in that text. Here, let me show you. Dialogue between a Japanese and an inquirer. This is page 35-36. The Japanese says, a famous book by Dilthey has the name Experience and Poetry. Remember that what we saw, that Buber always mentions Dilthey as his real teacher. Eh? So I even think this is sort of not coincidental that Dilthey comes up here. A famous book by Dilthey has the name Experience and Poetry. The Inquirer, which is Heidegger, says, to experience in this sense always means to refer back, to refer life and lived experience back to the I. Experience is the name for the referral of the objective back to the subject. When I experience something, I as a subject have a relation to something that is object for me. Yeah? The much discussed I-Thou experience too belongs within the metaphysical sphere of subjectivity. And that's all that he says about it. Right. Of course, we know that Buber explicitly says this is not an experience, it's a relation. And he makes a whole point of, he has a whole critique of the notion of experience in the beginning of I and Thou. You will remember that. Experience is the surface of the world. It is putting things at my disposal. That's I, it. Yeah? So why does why in this text is there such a deliberate misunderstanding or misconstrual of Buber going on? One thing to say, Buber has not moved on from Dilthey. The world has experienced, to me, that is just an alteration of the German idealist framework, and it doesn't really bring anything new. I think it's interesting to see this. Yeah? But Buber says, and this is from the word that is spoken, many modern that often means de-Socratized, I mentioned already, philosophers have fallen with the totality of their thought world into a monologizing hubris, something which rarely happens to a poet. But this monologism, which to be sure is well acquainted with the existential, but not with the existential, this wrongly translated in the English. In this text, in the English text, it says existentialist and existential. I can see why Morris Friedman chose that translation, but it's a bit misleading. Existential means the existential. The existentialen are the dimensions of Dasein that related to being, such as time and existential with a small e here. Existential means whatever has to do with our concrete existence as people. So this and here so you see how radical this critique is, although it doesn't mention Heidegger at all, or he just uses the words, and so people know that it's about this. This monologism, which to be sure is well acquainted with the existential, and that would be for Heidegger what was more important, the thinking of being, but not with the existential in the sense of the concrete existence of the person, which for Heidegger was not important, means in all its conjuring force the starkest menace of disintegration. Then a page later it says, in my judgment, one should fight the misuse of great old words rather than teach the use of new manufactured ones, which Heidegger, of course, also does all the time. You could say that here there is an implicit, I'm going a bit fast now, but you could say that here there is a kind of implicit extension of this critique of monological hubris to Heidegger. Do you see that? So he's saying here implicitly Heidegger's philosophy is also a form of monological hubrism, and quite different from the critique that is voiced against Buber's own thought in that previous paragraph. Let's listen to I'm almost done. Let's listen to the dialogue on language a little bit further, where this definition of language comes up that comes out of the Japanese intellectual tradition. So let's read here on this page. The Japanese says, the fact that you give ear to me, or better, to the probing intimations I propose, awakens in me the confidence to drop my hesitations, which have so far kept me from answering your question. This has been going on for pages. He doesn't want to give the answer. It's a very dramatic, theatrical text. This Japanese person feels it's not the right time to say what language is. You mean the question which word in your language speaks for what we Europeans call language? Up to this moment, I've shied away from that word because I must give a translation which makes our word for language look like a mere pictograph, to wit, something that belongs within the precincts of conceptual ideas. For European science and its philosophy try to grasp the nature of language only by way of concepts. What is the Japanese word for language? After further hesitation, the Japanese says, it is koto-ba. And what does that say? Ba means leaves, including and especially the leaves of a blossom, petals. Think of cherry blossoms or plum blossoms. And what does koto say? This is the question most difficult to answer. But it is easier now to attempt an answer because we have ventured to explain iki, the pure delight of the beckoning stillness. That's what went before. The breath of stillness that makes this beckoning delight come into its own is the rain under which that delight is made to come. But Koto always names that which in the event gives delight itself, that which uniquely in each unrepeatable moment comes to radiance in the fullness of its grace. And then the inquirer says, Koto then would be the appropriating occurrence of the lightening message of grace. The appropriating occurrence of the lightening message of grace. Beautifully said. Only when then they start to talk about grace being a religious word. The appropriating occurrence, that is language as the house of being. That is the gift of the lightening message of grace. This lightening message is what lights up into the clearing, into unconcealment, the beings, and the human being is the graceful and grateful recipient of that moment. Is the place where that can occur, as the shepherd of being. So you see here how Heidegger tries to move to sort of say, oh, we're talking about the same thing, and it's a matter of grace. And remember that Buber also talks about grace, yeah. But of course, this is now very far removed from dialogue as Buber understands it. Yeah. So from the word that is spoken, and then I'm going to really stop. Just to contrast that view of language. Buber says a pre-communicative stage of language is unthinkable. Man did not exist before having a fellow being, before he lived over against him, toward him, and that means before he had dealings with him. Language never existed before address. It could become monologue only after dialogue broke off or broke down, whereas koto-ba is monologue. The only address there is that the human being is addressed by being or by language. That language is given to us, but there is no address from person to person there, quite the contrary. At first, the word probably was neither a noun nor a verb. He quotes Hamann, but at least a whole period, a proposition, so a subject and a predicate, not just a subject or just a predicate, but the two together as an original unity. If Stefan Georg is saying that no thing exists for which the word is wanting may hold true for things, it is inapplicable to the situations that man is given to know before he comes to know the things. We are caught up in situations in which we are relating with others, and those are prior to our knowledge of things. And they are expressed in whole sentences and not in words, in individual words. The word is a sentence. Buber was very interested, you saw that in the text, in what he called these, I think that linguistically that's now a bit dated, but the so-called holophrastic languages, where one word has suffixes added to it so that it becomes a subject-predicate unity. So where the difference between the sentence and the word does not exist. And he calls that a kind of primitive form of linguistic, of grammar. But you can see why he's interested in it, because this saying something about something, the proposition, is the primary act, the primary speech act. And that is related to a situational relational context. The mystery of the coming to be of language and that of the coming to be of man are one. It's a mystery. There is maybe that is the same for Heidegger. We're dealing here with a mystery. We're not dealing here with a problem for linguistics or philosophy of language. We're trying to become aware of a mystery. The moment of surprise is the ontological basic presupposition of conversation. That's the encounter again. Yeah? And then he says, and that's a final critique of Heidegger, the end of the text, the word that is spoken. The truth that is concerned in this fashion, he speaks about the truth of conversation or dialogue, is not the sublime unconcealment suitable to being itself, the aletheia, the unconcealment of the Greeks. That's Heidegger. Yeah? It is the simple conception of truth of the Hebrew Bible, whose etymon, whose etymon means faithfulness, being true or being. We talked about what that means for 2 sessions ago. The human truth of which I speak, the truth vouchsafed man. That's another point. Heidegger is going too far. Yeah. So this is what we know. This is what we understand. Is no pneuma that pours itself out from above on a band of men now becomes super-personal. It opens itself to one just in one's existence as a person. To equate Heidegger to a kind of pneumatology, so to a theology of the spirit, and to say that this pours itself out over a band of men becomes super personal. It's like, you know, the National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party, or the community that we all rally behind the Führer. There's a clear indication here of the critique of fascism and of discarding Heidegger's ontological project, because Heidegger, of course, would be the first one to say that what he tries to do with the rethinking the relation between thinking and being has nothing to do with Christian theology, with pneumatology. So I'll leave this. What I've tried to explain, I hope that it's been useful at all, but what I tried to explain was that how both have worked with a reflection on language to provide a fundamental critique of Cartesian modern philosophy. But whereas for Buber, this leads the way into the spoken word, for Heidegger, this leads the way into language as event, language as the language that speaks itself rather than us speaking the language. And I think that ultimately politically translates into the difference between a humanist project and a fascist project. And I don't think Heidegger ever was able to get beyond that. You can see that even in the discussion on redemption and reconciliation that Paul analyzes at the end of the article. Even there, when Heidegger late in life reads the letter that Buber published, or an article that Buber published in Merkur, I think, and is very enthusiastic about what Buber says there about reconciliation. Even there, you see that Heidegger can only frame it in terms of a belonging together, in this case of Jews and Germans, in the light of something that is more than what they are, and that is primordially connects them together as belonging together, rather than framing and crafting a concrete relationship between people with all the difficulties that brings. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction, but as usual, I've gone far too long.
That's been really helpful.
I hope so. Yeah.
Should we have a 5-minute break to just absorb and then?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that. Yeah. Let's have a 5-minute break. Think about some questions and points for discussion and comment, and then we, yeah. Wow. Okay.
I think Paul wants to speak.
Oh, go ahead.
Paul, you're silenced.
You have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just two or three brief comments. Buber, as you undoubtedly know, crystallized or gave fullness to his understanding of dialogue together with his two crucial partners, one being Franz Rosenzweig, and the other man named Eugen Rosenstock. In an essay that Rosenzweig wrote 2 years after I Am Thou, which gave expression to his common quest to understand the human, if you wish, in an essay called Das Neue Denken, the New Thinking. And there is a very pregnant statement in which Rosenzweig presents what he called Sprachdenken, speech thinking. And in speech thinking, we realize that the other person to whom we address not only has ears to hear what we say, but a mouth to reply. And that's crucial for understanding of dialogue. Rosenstock added to that, he says, I shall listen, although I may change. I shall listen to the other as he or she speaks in response to what I say, although I may change. And what is crucial, again, as Rosenzweig elaborates, what shared concerns with Buber is that usually we listen to the other and we rehearse what we're going to say, as opposed to responding what the other person has to say. And that's what the other person has to say need not be with words. It could be visceral. And that's crucial, as I recall, for Buber. And one further comment, going back to Descartes. I have a student who's writing a paper on Descartes' problem with what he calls the malicious demon. The malicious demon constantly nags at him, dragging him back into the everyday, where he doesn't want to be, because that's where truth is to be found. But it's precisely that malicious demon that Buber honors. That is our fellow human beings, who bring us back into the everyday with all its difficulties. And of course, Vic mentioned the Buber's Hasidic stories. They all come to tell us that God is to be met in the everyday, with all its flux. And here there's another connection with Heidegger, of course. Both wrote about Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic thinker. The world is not static, it's a constant flow. It looks, perhaps when we look at the river, it seems to be the same river, but actually there's a constant change. And that is the everyday reality. It's not one fixed moment. And that everyday reality includes our fellow human beings and ourselves. We change. We have temperaments. We have needs. One other thought I just throw into the basket. Buber was influenced by Max Scheler. He had differences with Max Scheler, but Max Scheler helped give expression to what was now called philosophical anthropology. And within that context, Max Scheler, who sought to somehow wed, to speak in coarse terms, phenomenology, which means how we as individuals see the world and encounter the world, with existentialism, made a claim that was crucial to Buber. And that is, we're not only rational beings, but we are loving beings. And loving means that we seek the other. We need the other. And the other needs us in what is called love. Of course, Scheler was a deeply religious individual, went through various cycles. He was, as you perhaps know, his mother came from an Orthodox Jewish family. His father was a Protestant, and he eventually became a Catholic, and then was confused about being Catholic, but he remained profoundly religious in the sense that he's informed by the notion of love. But he means it phenomenologically, of course. We're not only rational beings, we're loving beings. And love is a dialogical moment. And we don't only give love, but we also need love. Anyway, there's a few comments I just throw out just listening to your very wonderful and nuanced presentation of the issues at hand.
I think it's useful to point out that this essay on Heraclitus the what's it called, the knowledge of man, what is common to all is precisely around the status of this word logos. And he tries to show that logos means the word that is spoken between people. rather than this Heideggerian logos as the collecting together into a
Precisely.
into a unity. Yeah, precisely. But I guess
It's also really interesting. All those things you said, Paul, were really fascinating. But the notion that we're not just rational beings, we're also people who love. We're loving beings.
And need love.
And we need love. And sometimes it's hard for us to receive love, even when it's offered in our direction. We can't take it in. Either we feel undeserving of that love, or we feel that love makes us too vulnerable. But in either case, it's interesting where Buber talks about love, or how Buber talks about love, or whether he does, and whether love is a kind of dialogical relationship. How much of that does he get from Scheler? Does Scheler remain an influence on his writing? And in what way, even though he's learnt that, I'm struck by how Buber talks about loving relationship, or our need for love, or does he because in this conversation, in the word that is spoken, there's very little said about love explicitly as part of a relationship.
Oh, just a very quick response. In Between Man and Man, not only does this discuss Heidegger, he also discusses Scheler and of course Husserl.
He talks about it there. Also talks about in I and Ours, this discussion of love and erotic love and the difference between the two. I guess from the point of view of Heidegger, if we can just sort of, as by way of sort of, evil genie, maybe draw us back from daily life into philosophy for a minute. I guess the question Heidegger would probably pose would be, okay, dialogue, it's all great, but then, so what do you talk about? What is there to talk about? Do you see my point? That
you talk about dialogue, that's what you do.
Well, we try and enter dialogue, but we engage in dialogue.
Well, when Rosenstock-Huessy says, "I'll listen, but I might change," or listen to what? To your opinions, or to your experiences, or your take on things, or so for
Isn't there an awareness of how often language, particularly when language becomes abstracted or conceptual, or we simply see ourselves through philosophical terms, we can get lost in language. And language itself can be a form of escape, which at some level both Heidegger and Buber kind of recognize. But one of the differences that's not often mentioned, but in terms of the Wittgenstein work, particularly the later Wittgenstein work, very strong emphasis upon needing to come back to the everyday, to reconnect to the everyday, in order to understand what we're really saying. But often we don't understand what we're saying because the concepts have kind of become disconnected and language has become disconnected. So the relationship of language to presence, to what extent are we present in our words? And when Johann says that in the later Heidegger, it's language that speaks us, the language is always there, it speaks us. It closes down the question of how present I am in my language. Even as I'm speaking now, I'm nearly there. I'm kind of trying to be, or I'm struggling to be present in my words. Now that notion of being present in our words opens up the possibility of tension a constant tension, absolutely central to feminist work, between language and experience, that we get lost in our language, and often we're not saying, or we need to be brought back to the everyday. And that practice of being brought back to the everyday, in this later moment, I wonder how that features both for Heidegger and for Buber in different ways, whether the Wittgenstein thing challenges the kind of abstractness that you can sometimes experience at this stage and the later stage in terms of Buber and Heidegger, even if in very different ways.
Yeah. Okay, so Vic, I'm going to cut you short because we have too much time. Ben, Michael wanted to respond, and then
yes. There was a time when I was very, very interested in the origins of language, because there is, in fact, a tremendous amount of literature by anthropologists and linguists theorizing literally what is the origin of language. I mean, by, you know, what was the first word, really? And this is not philosophical. I guess it is indirectly philosophical. In fact, the topic got so hot that the primary Journal of Linguistics refused to accept any more papers, and they closed down the subject of the origin of language.
Yeah.
And one of the theories that was posed at the time was that the origin of language is lying. That is, since there are communications among animals, and all communications among animals are sincere. That is, as you were saying, Johan, about communication. If a sound or an utterance or a gesture is mechanically connected to its origin, then it might communicate some meaning, but it's not language until it's disconnected. That is, if I yell the word snake and there is no snake and everyone takes off and I get the food, then I have invented the word for snake. That is, the disconnection of a signifier with its reference is precisely what makes language. So language, in fact, originates in deception. And the constant option is that people are lying, or we are lying since we speak all the time about absent presences. That's what we're doing right now. We are conjuring things that are really not here at all. Memories, options, futures, ghosts, etc., etc. This is the power of language. It's not aletheia, it's the exact opposite. It's to conceal truth, and to use truth to gain all kinds of advantage. So, you know, I wouldn't be trusting language. I would be thanking language for letting us escape presence.
Yeah. Hannah Arendt makes the same point. Yeah, so it's pissing down, and you can say, "What a beautiful day," and that means that you're free. Yeah,
that means that you're free. Exactly. I've never known exactly how to pursue that into my own areas, but thanks for letting me say that.
That is very, very, very relevant. Lacan also makes this point. People lie the truth more often than they tell the truth. Yeah. Katrina.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's there implicitly towards the end of the word that is spoken, where Buber's talking about that it's not a signal and it's not a cry for help. It's something more, and it's something to do with the situation. And it's also, he mentions the fact that it's the possibility of communicating with one's, I think he says, kinsman or some kind of ally, in such a way that those who are also present, who are my enemy, will not be able to understand. So I think he's gesturing towards also this possibility.
Lovely. Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah.
And coming back to what Vic was saying about presence, I found the three-part. So I did a bit of an experiment because Johan, you said at the beginning, let's reflect on how we kind of engaged with this text. So I kind of sat there, closed my eyes, and just listened to Buber's voice to see if I would, receive the text differently, because it is about the spoken word. I found his delivery actually really powerful. his voice is tired and fragile, but his pacing is really slow and deliberate. I found it actually quite priestly. Maybe that's just to do with my own formation and my associations. It's kind of like the delivery of a sermon into my ears. But what happens, the rhythm of it comes across very clearly if you have the oral delivery. And so something like Bestand, Besitz, and Begebenheit, so that tripartite structure of our potential for language, the possession of language, and then the actual event, that really comes through very, very clearly. And then just, if I may, because I'm on a sort of philological riff here, I just wanted to ask you, Johan, when you showed the slides on the penultimate slide, you had the reference to Stefan George, which comes up in that text, and now it seems it's a thread, it's a sort of a Heideggerian thread there too. But the translation is quite, if I can just focus in there, because in the translation that you showed, it was given as no thing exists for which the word is wanting. But then if we go back to where that comes from in George, kein Ding sei, wo das Wort gebricht, it's almost the opposite. I think it is a distortion in that translation, because if we look at that, it's in a rhyming couplet that is to do with Verzicht, so renunciation, or giving up, or something lacking. So it's more that the speaker in the poem can't get at, because I think there's something about that formulation, no thing exists for which the word is wanting. That would imply that everything that exists has the word that it needs.
Yeah.
Whereas actually the primacy of the word here in calling forth the thing is more what's being gestured.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I wondered about just the translation there, and if that comes up elsewhere as something that's problematized, or is that just I wonder how other translations of George might have it, because obviously George here in the kind of context that you've been sketching, he's also a highly problematic figure. So this is a text that's coming from Das Neue Reich, and so the fact that Buber invokes him at this point in the Das gesprochene Wort lecture, it's a deliberate choice to complicate that relationship between the thing and its existence and language. And I just wondered if you could shed a bit more light on that.
Well, I think he obviously says that because he has Heidegger's text in mind. So this is a response to Heidegger going on for page after page, quoting George about that's. I think it's absolutely that. I wonder if the argument that he makes there, the distinction between things and situations, whether that really holds water. I don't know what I found that very difficult to understand myself, because he tries to take sort of George literally and says, yeah, that may be true for things, that if the word fails or breaks off, maybe you might say, then the thing can't be. But that doesn't apply to situation. Almost as if he's saying the word there is always whole. Remember that he prefaces, but this is in the discussion, in the context of the discussion between, or this sort of pseudo-linguistic discussion of the relation between the period, the whole sentence, and the noun and the verb, or the subject and the predicate. And so he's almost trying to say, with respect to that original use of language, which is the period and not the word, and it expresses a situation rather than a thing, or names not a thing, but it expresses a situation. That use of language, that precedes that which George is talking about. I don't know if that makes sense, but
so that those holophrastic examples, or this one, he talks about the polysynthetic languages of the Inuit, and you think he's aware that he's on shaky ground there linguistically. Advancing this as a pseudo-linguistic argument, and is it then proposing that those situations are prior, so ontologically prior to any? That's
what he's saying, but it seems to me that this becomes so Heidegger would say, I think Paul quoted that in the article, Buber was not a philosopher, because this has nothing to do with the question of being that Heidegger is trying to address. And he's trying to address the relation between language and being, and not an ontic distinction between talking about things and talking about situations. That would be still within the level of the ontic for Heidegger. It would just be about the contents of the world, the words we have for that, rather than this this more fundamental point where language gives the possibility of being. So I found it very difficult to understand, but the fact that he involved George is maybe, now that you're saying that, I'm thinking, yes, there is a kind of difficult situation there. Why would he do that? Why would he so obvious? Why would he, don't know, maybe Paul, if you have a view, and he travels to Germany a few years after the war, and then he starts to refer to Stefan George. Yeah? He could have made the same point without doing that. What is the need to mention this highly problematic figure? I don't have a better answer.
Just a quick comment on those pages. I also found that sort of puzzling and peculiar, trying to figure out what he was saying about the origins of language. But I guess I just took him to be, in calling situations rather than things primary, took him to be wanting to argue that that language itself arises always from the dialogical relationship among people. So it's not just the need to label things. It's not just that there's an apple there and I need to say that's an apple, but rather I'm hungry, or would you share your apple with me, or something like that. That it's those situations which are always already relational, or dealing with that between space among persons. That's where language is coming from. So that's how I read those pages, even though I don't quite know how to turn that into a claim about where the first words came from or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting that he makes his point. He tries to argue in quite a scientific way by saying, look inside yourself, the moment of articulation, that is preceded, that is monological because you know already what you're trying to say to yourself, but it's preceded by something that's non-linguistic, so we can't look there. But then also phylogenetically, we can't look at the origin of speech in the early human communities or so, because of this, that doesn't work. So he tries to develop some kind of argument around it to say then that language is originally communicative, or is primordially a situation of address. And then, of course, you open yourself up to the advancement of science, because I think that although that discussion, the origin of language, was halted for a long time, right now it is hotly researched in the context of evolutionary biology, of course. And I think Chomsky's latest view, he tends to change his views quite regularly, but his latest view is that language does not have a communicative origin at all, and is actually very, very ill-suited for communication because we all have our own ideas about stuff. And how do you know that I'm talking about the same thing as you? So he says that this innate grammar that transformation generative grammar talked about is the ability that we have to create representations and symbolizations of our own experiences through time to ourselves. So we can create our own taxonomies and registers of things that we have experienced, so that, and we can group them in ways that may be relevant to us. And that is essentially a monological cognitive activity that human being has in a much more open and creative way than other animals. And once we had discovered that we have that, we found out that you can use it to more or less talk with each other about, what you think, what I think, and but it's by no means a perfect instrument, and it makes it very difficult a lot of the time. So there's a contemporary perspective that would turn the tables on this. What he tries to present as a kind of self-evident argument that naturally you have to say language has a communicative origin. And I think that this sort of scientific view accords much more with how Heidegger sees it. And it also opens our understanding to the fact that Heidegger is actually thinking the information age in a way. You could put it like that. So that's where then we're back to the question of humanism. That you don't need to be human to have language in the way that Heidegger talks about it. Yeah. But it's a difficult thing. But thanks for that suggestion. Yeah. So any other comments at this point? We're closing. Yeah. Oh, Paul. Yeah. No, who?
No, it wasn't. That position, the Chomsky one, is a way of in saying that it's either internal or individualized, and then we use it to relate to others.
Yeah.
Does defend is a way of staying on to his original kind of Cartesian grammar frame. So you could see it as a slightly defensive move against those people who challenged it. The Wittgenstein move, which is a slightly different one, isn't to talk about language generally, or sees it as a kind of potential mistake to think too generally about language as what differentiates. So the example linked to what's known as John was saying before, the child that reaches for an apple, the reaching action, the bodily reaching, is part of trying to kind of draw to the parent's attention that it's an apple that they want, this kind of desire. The language then becomes a way of drawing out an alternative form of expression for the embodied behavior, which is in fact the reaching. So in that way, the body becomes much more, the notion of language is somehow embodied in the later Wittgenstein's work, becomes really quite significant as a way of challenging the autonomy of language as a structure of meaning, somehow separated from our existence as communicative beings who, as Paul reminded us, are loving beings already in relationship with others. And it's in that context that language developed, I would have thought.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
But can I just say one thing quickly? As much as I hate to agree with Heidegger, isn't he just recounting, isn't it a both and? I mean, we all come into a world of literature. We read poetry before we understand it. We read Shakespeare. There's a world of language that tells us what to look for and how to feel, and we grow into a literature that's part of our culture. And I think that's phenomenologically correct. If our language were to depend only on our own encounters and our own experiences and our own desires, it would be hugely impoverished. I mean, we're readers of philosophy. People were philosophizing before we came along. We are thrown into literature as much as we're thrown into, the world. Yeah. And we're taught to think by other people's language, which stretches back 10,000 years or more. So surely Heidegger's right in that sense.
Yeah.
That language precedes us. That literature certainly precedes us.
Yeah, yeah.
That it exists before we do, but our coming into language or coming into literature is also a process of our own kind of development, whereby we might want to question the autonomy or independence of language. So we might want a more embodied conception that our movements, our expressions of love are as much part of our bodily movements towards someone as they are an expression in words. And it just allows you that space, for gesture, for bodily movement, to think that it's not just literature, it's that's part of what we learn from literature, is the way in which we kind of share in very complicated relationships, how we survive.
Yeah, so that's of course, and so Katrina picks up the point around apples with Sloterdijk's idea of the voice being a form of extension of the umbilical cord. I think that's very, very beautiful metaphor in a way.
Emily wants to speak.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Emily, go ahead. I didn't notice.
I don't know what's happening, sorry. According to the psychoanalysts, I'm thinking of Melanie Klein and Ferenczi. Language originated in the fields and is directly related to our search for food. It began in the fields when farmers and the harvesters were trying to communicate with each other. And so we cannot think, they think that we cannot think of language without thinking for our search for food. And it has to do with the bodily, what Vic was saying, with the bodily movements, the rhythm of the bodily movements while seeking for food. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, these are all, I think, very important and valid points. I just wanted to sort of, I'm not going to defend Heidegger or so, but I think Heidegger tries to get us to move a little bit beyond these kinds of thoughts. He would call them ontake. Yeah, so there's a lot to say about the history. So many languages in the world. There's something interesting to say about all of them. But that is something else, what he calls language. And so he would, for example, say it's not about becoming rich in language. We talked about enrichment through literature or so. It's about becoming poor. And he has this whole spiel on poverty and poverty of spirit that is necessary to find a relation to this mystery of language, to what language, because it may be true that language ontically, historically arises out of the need for food or to communicate to the parent and the child, but that in that a world opens up to us, that in that and through that beings appear, that we can become witness to something that we may be part of in a certain way, but also stand outside and behold or can say that this activity of being able to say anything at all and to inhabit speech in that way, that is something else, that is on ontake level. And I think that is the big question that maybe does not speak to us so much now as it did some years ago. What to make of this ontological difference that for Heidegger pervades the heart of what language is all about. And in a way you could say Buber tries to steer away from by talking about the relation and talking about the dialogue and the exchange of the word. But in another sense maybe does get back, because for him this whole I-down relationship is ultimately grounded in something that exceeds the sphere of the human. So I think there's in both a kind of invitation to think, to look away from a too much inner worldly account of this mystery of language. Okay, hey, I'm conscious of the fact that we're 2 minutes past 6 o'clock, and that we also have our list of themes. Maybe we should do that via email. Is that okay? I just send out the list again, and please respond to me if you would like to be part of a little very informal kind of working group that looks at a particular theme and either thinks about it or discusses it offline, or maybe prepare a session. We have already had a few where people have said that they would be happy to work on themes. I've put them up here. So we have this language and symbolic power, feminist dialogue with Buber, which would be great because we have a session on the 8th of March, and that's International Women's Day. Anastasia has suggested that she'd be happy to bring together a group of people to sort of work on that. So maybe you're interested in that. Patricia, who is not here today, I believe, or maybe she is, was happy to lead the theme of intersubjectivity. Jordan, I think you said something about philosophy dialogue with children. So I will send this list out again rather than discuss it now. And please let us know what you'd be interested in. We'll try to whittle it down then to 6 themes, and they will form the basis of the sessions that we'll have next term. And we'll see then how we do it. Stop share. Okay, so thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Can I make a suggestion, please?
Sure, Michael, yeah.
That the response to the email list should be, I would like to lead, or I could lead, or I would like to participate.
Very good, yeah.
Good idea.
Very good. We'll type this up. Yeah. And I'll put that in the email to remind people of that.
Okay.
So thanks all very much for what for me was a really exciting semester, spending time with all of you, looking at these interesting ideas. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all back after the holiday break.